How many times have you wanted to make a point and something happens at just the right moment that does it for you? You think, wow, this is really a dangerous intersection, and just then 2 cars collide right in front of you. Or this store really sells cheap furniture, and as if on cue, a customer sits in a chair and it collapses. Or you've all seen or maybe done this. You have to be careful in opening a champagne bottle, and then boom, and the cork embeds itself in the kitchen ceiling. Well, in preparing this talk for you today, I had one of those moments that more or less makes my case about as well as anything. Remember when you were in school, and about 10:30 in the morning, a bell would ring and the doors would fly open and everybody would be shooed outside for recess? I don't know about you, but recess was the highlight of my day and my favorite subject. We now have a Congress that feels exactly the same way. On Thursday, September 18th, your Congress flew out of the Capitol and will not return until mid-November. Now, they were tired. After all, on September 18th, they had been in session for a total of 8 days. Yes, you heard me correctly. From the end of July until mid-November, your Congress will have been in session for a total of 8 days. And what about issues such as the economy, jobs, ISIL, immigration, broken government, healthcare costs, healthcare accessibility, poverty, infrastructure, federal debt? Forget it. They have to get home. So thank you, Congress, for your cooperation in making my show and tell here today come alive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss the prospect of term limits with you. As John said, my name is Ted Leach. I'm a retired newspaper publisher, having published newspapers in Peterborough, South Carolina, and Nantucket Island, Massachusetts. I care about our system of government, and I think it's time to make a major mid-course correction before the whole system becomes bogged down due to political bickering and showmanship. So I'm here today to talk to you about term limits, talking at the federal level. Yes, in 5th grade you were taught we have term limits. It's called elections. That garnered you an A in the 5th grade. But that notion today sounds like something out of a Disney movie. If ever there was a window for a movement for advocating for term limits, it is now. Virtually all studies that measure the approval of Congress conclude that it is an all-time low, and it is not something that just happened. Americans loathe Congress. It has a favorability rate today of 8%. Those ratings are lower than cockroaches, traffic jams, even colonoscopies. Don't worry about trying to read the detail here. The important piece is the flow. This shows the approval ratings of Congress from 1993 to 2013. The curve has continually decreased, and it is finally evident that the majority of Americans feel that our system is broken. Yet, 90% of incumbents are re-elected. Too many people have elevated their congressperson to some sort of pedestal because he or she speaks a language that we don't understand, and therefore they must be competent to carry out the duties of the office. But with the kind of negative approval shown on this graph, real term limits is no longer a dream. It has a decent shot at becoming the law of the land. Here's the short version of my term limit game plan. Let me say at the outset, this is a totally nonpartisan effort. I work diligently to expunge anything that may sound partisan, but I'm quite certain that there may occasionally be something that will slip out that has a partisan edge. When that happens, just forget the partisan part. And one final note before we proceed. When I speak of Congress, I'm speaking of it as an institution and not taking shots at individual members. The institution over the years has created the swamp in which they must now live. Today, I hope to explain how we can drain that swamp. Often people come up to me after hearing my spiel and they say something like, I was trying to figure out your politics, where you were coming from all during your talk. I'm not carrying water for any faction, and in the interest of full disclosure, here is a very brief overview of my political journey. In college, I was just to the right of Attila the Hun. After college, I went to work for Bud Wilkinson, the famous Oklahoma University football coach who was running for the U.S. Senate. Bud was a moderate Republican, and he lost. 2 years later, I was the campaign coordinator for State Senator Dewey Bartlett of Oklahoma. Dewey was also a moderate Republican. We faced a spirited primary against the ultra-right wing of the Oklahoma Republican Party. We beat them, and we won the general election, and Dewey became the second Republican governor in the history of the state. He then went on to become a U.S. Senator in 1972 with another freshman senator, Joe Biden. Dewey was diagnosed with lung cancer and did not run for re-election. He died in 1979 at the age of 59. My political fulcrum was moving more and more toward the center. In 1987, I had sold the Monadnock Ledger, and I wanted to see what the New Hampshire primary looked like from a candidate's point of view. I had met Vice President Bush several times during my stint as editor of an oil magazine and later as a newspaper publisher, so I volunteered. I was suddenly in charge of the Bush family. Whenever any of them came into the state, it was my job to get them before multiple audiences. In 2000, I ran as a Republican for the New Hampshire House and was re-elected in 2002. One of the first bills I sponsored was for campaign finance reform. I continued my political realignment toward the center. I am now classified as undeclared, or if you will, an independent. Today, I would describe myself as fiscally conservative, socially moderate to liberal. I don't trust government as much as my Democratic friends do, but when there's a job to be done and no one is rising to the challenge, I'm not afraid to pull the government lever. We don't get as much bang for the buck when we entrust projects to government, but I hasten to add that much of the time it is not the result of lack of effort on the part of government employees as much as it is the result of their having to perform with a nonstop kaleidoscope of congressional wants, whims, and desires, many of which are purely politically motivated. They come by the thousands and clog up the process of trying to effectively administer the affairs of government. So now you know who is standing before you today. There is no research to back this up, but I am certain that the number one item on the agenda of any congressperson is not, how can I get a bigger salary? It is not, how can I get free health care? It is not, how can I get a lifelong pension? The single most important item on all congressional agendas is, how can I get reelected? Again, the single most important item on all congressional agendas is, how can I get reelected? Re-election. That is the time bomb in our current system. And if every one of you will pay me 5 cents for every time I mention the word re-election today, I can finally pay off my college loans. Re-election. That political reality trumps everything else on the agenda of Congress. How can I get reelected? Skews decision-making. How can I get reelected? Invites poorly thought out legislation. How can I get reelected? Encumbers government with layer upon layer of needless programs and the new bureaucracy necessary to administer them. How can I get reelected? Consumes a huge amount of the congressperson's time. It is estimated that members of Congress spend 65 to 75% of their time raising money to get reelected. Where is your Congress today, October 6, 2014? They're home, trying to get reelected. We have an ISIS crisis, an immigration mess, and dozens of other front burner issues, and the people who should be making decisions are not in the schoolhouse. They are on recess and won't return to class for another month. So for 65 to 75% of the time, they are doing nothing for the country. They are doing nothing for their constituents. They are totally disengaged from everything that they were there to address. The frenzy of re-election has become a case study in dereliction. They are dialing for dollars while everything else is pushed into the background. He was right. So my goal is to get the money out of the system. The way you do that is to take away any opportunity to get reelected. So here's my plan. Gasp. Stay with me. It will work out. 1 3-year term for a House member. Turn over 1/3 of the House every year. 1 6-year term for a senator. Turn over 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years. 1 6-year term for a president and vice president. Some term limit sites talk about just 2 or 3 terms. That accomplishes nothing except to eliminate a person. The problem today isn't so much the people as the money that purchased them. If someone can stay for 2 terms, then there is a re-election dance, and that cotillion is paid for by the special interests. The result is layer upon layer of payoff or feel-good legislation that is costly, cumbersome, and pure nonsense. Few of them give a hoot about the effect on the bureaucracy, how it will be paid for, or how it will be monitored. All they want is that bullet on their political resume so they have something to smooth the path toward re-election. And a few other pieces of the term limit rule, just to nail down the escape routes. No running for another office until you've been out of office for a period of 4 years. If anyone can remember who the hell you were after 4 years, then you were probably should take another run at it. This 4-year prohibition keeps the members in daisy chaining from one office to another, and you can never return to the same office regardless of how many years you've been gone. With this 1-term restriction, re-election is off the table, and that immediately kills the need to raise any funds. If a person can't run for office for a 2nd term, the decision-making becomes more focused, more real, more common sense, and conscience-driven. If a person can't run for a 2nd term, legislation that is absurd and poorly thought out is put aside. There are no future chips to be played. And there is another very real reason that legislators will be more inclined to cut out the legislative posturing and foolishness that we read about daily. Stay tuned, that will be revealed in just a few minutes. If a person can't run for office for a 2nd term, skip one, I'll read it to you. If a person can't run for office for a 2nd term, unnecessary and wasteful government spending declines because members are freer to allow common sense and conscience to enter into the decision-making process. And if a person can't run for re-election for a 2nd term, time that was previously spent dialing for dollars can now be utilized to research key issues, talk with experts, talk with constituents, and arrive at a vote based on combining all those ingredients and not a vote predicated on the expectation of some donor. Unfortunately, what is missing from most debates about congressional finance reform is the concept of term limits, which in my opinion is the only foolproof method to vacuum out the money. Without term limits, we are continuing to allow members to run for re-election. And if they are running to get re-elected, they are looking for money. And that money is coming from special interests on both the right and the left. Without term limits, Congress will continue to be for sale, and there will continue to be less turnover of inventory. Add to that the gerrymandering that has created 70 to 80% of House districts that are virtually bulletproof, and suddenly you end up with a chamber full of purchased lifers. The successful term limit plan must take the ability to run for re-election out of the equation. Any term limits effort that allows for re-election, even for a small number of terms, is only going to periodically replace personnel, but the money will still be 100% in play. With term limits in place, we will have representatives and senators who are not focused on re-election because they can't run for re-election. The website Open Secrets sums it up as follows. Congressional committee assignments are competitive. Lawmakers who win seats on the lucrative banking, tax writing, and commerce committees quite often enhance their campaign war chests from industries seeking to influence legislative outcomes. However, if they can't run for re-election, why do they need lobbyist money? They don't. So what will lobbyists do? Some of the K Street crowd, the street of lobbyists, will probably try to fund the first and only election of members-to-be. But the member-to-be, once sworn in, doesn't need that lobbyist anymore. So it is no longer a slam dunk for the money merchants. Also, other members of the body will know that this person was sponsored, bought, and paid for. So they will dismiss it as a pawn, an errand boy for the special interests. I'm not a believer in campaign finance reform legislation because I've never seen it work. How many times do we need to run headlong into a brick wall? History has shown us that there's always some group that finds a loophole, a way around the campaign finance legislation. Campaign money is like water. It always finds an outlet. Remember your history. The 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, commonly known as McCain-Feingold, was intended to close the soft money loophole for political parties. So money was then diverted into issue ads and so-called 527 groups. Now the 527s have been displaced by super PACs and 501c4s. And when a loophole is found, what is to keep the Supreme Court from blessing that loophole? But you don't need a Supreme Court opinion on this. 3 years equals 3 years. 6 years equals 6 years. No ambiguity, no gray. Some lobbyists will try to funnel money to sitting members. It's called a bribe. But we have some pretty stiff laws for that, and I doubt many members will play that game. And without the need to get reelected, most members should buckle down and do the job they were elected to do. And common sense should return to the decision-making process. Members can no longer hide from their constituencies because, guess what? They have to go home after one term. Remember a few minutes ago that there was another reason one-term legislators might abandon the posturing and foolishness that we read about daily? The knowledge that they have to go home at the end of the term could be a very real deterrent to that kind of nonsense. Yes, some may show up in Congress with hardcore agendas, but without the ongoing good old boy club, the multi-decade seniority pyramid, they're going to have a difficult time pushing through some pet project. Other members will look at such attempts and say, you're out of your mind. I also think you will get a better caliber of candidate. Because some people who have a lot to offer will say, it's only X number of years. I don't have to raise money again. I'll give it a shot. You may have some people who will try to use the platform of being a former member of Congress to propel themselves into some future position, but that concern is trivial when measured against the mess we are dealing with today. With term limits, some may be concerned about having the government at risk of being under control of unelected bureaucrats. At first glance, that seems to be a valid concern, and it was the basis of my objection to term limits for many years. But today, I'm confident that with term limits, and thus a more intelligent group of congresspeople who aren't dancing to the tune of their donors, that concern fades. And members of Congress have almost limitless resources with which to address, research, and acquaint themselves about a given issue. Here is a living testimonial about how things work in the legislative arena. When I was in the legislature, I had two mentors. One of them was former Governor Walter Peterson, and the other was Dick Amidon of Hancock. Both knew the legislative process inside and out. Walter as a former governor, and Dick as a former legislator, and then head of the Legislative Services section that handles the writing of all legislation. Both told me exactly the same thing. Talk with everyone, because those conversations will guide you toward the workable solution to whatever is at stake. But always be mindful of who you are talking to. I was on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, and among our responsibilities, we were to oversee legislative requests relative to state-regulated utilities such as Verizon, U.S. Cellular, Public Service of New Hampshire. So, for instance, if legislation was proposed wherein Public Service wanted to do something with, say, one of its coal-burning power plants, here was the sequencing. First, the legislation, the bill, was presented to the full committee, with people on all sides of the issue supplying testimony. This might last a couple of hours or a couple of days. This is where the topic was framed and where the initial arguments for and against were presented. If, as a legislator, you missed this piece, you were way behind the eight ball. It then went to a smaller committee inside the larger committee. This subcommittee dealt with specific subjects, and they were able to take additional testimony and drill down into the issue. And that's how all legislation works, whether it be in New Hampshire or in Washington. To think that legislators read every bit of legislation is ludicrous. Instead, they rely on various committees to do the necessary legwork and research into crafting a good, solid piece of legislation. Once the main testimony was given to our committee, I would often go to the state agency that would have oversight of the effort. In the case of our hypothetical coal plant, it would be the Air Resources Division of the Department of Environmental Services. This fountain of unbiased information was there for the asking. This was where the technical expertise was to be found. Once I picked the brains of the air resources experts, it was time to talk with the various concerned parties or stakeholders. Of course, in this scenario, public service was number one on the list. So I went to its lobbyist and asked questions. She usually showed up with 2 or 3 people who were particularly well-versed on the issue. Mind you, this discussion was in addition to the original testimony that their people had given to the entire committee. I listened as they made their case. The advice of former Governor Peterson echoed in my ear. Always be aware of who you are talking to. In the course of the discussion, I would say, who's opposing this legislation and why? In the case of the coal burning unit, the opposition would most likely come from the Sierra Club. So following my discussion with public service, I might set up a meeting with the Sierra Club lobbyist and continue my prospecting. Then there may be calls to the Public Utilities Commission, ISO New England, or other stakeholders. Usually at that point, I picked the brains of our committee staff and inquired about the history of the issue, the key considerations, etc. Those staff members tried valiantly to keep from entering their personal dog in the race. They had seen and heard a lot over the years. They often knew the issues inside and out, and they were really helpful in allowing me to begin to sort out what I had heard and arrive at my own conclusion. So why am I telling you all of this? Because being a legislator or a congressperson is a job, and you do it the best you can. You don't need experience to know that it will be helpful to round up as much information as you can in order to arrive at a conclusion, perhaps a vote. You don't need experience to know that the more help you can find in order to bring all these stray pieces together, the better. However, when 65 to 75% of your time is devoted to something other than doing your job, such as raising money, your experience balloon isn't inflating. For a New Hampshire lawmaker, researching an issue is pretty much a solo performance. In New Hampshire, we have a Spartan playing field. After all, remember our state motto, live free and cheap. When I was in the New Hampshire legislature, our committee staff consisted of one half of one person, which was the same for all committees. Contrast that with committees in the U.S. Congress that average 68 staffers, people you can turn to for assistance. No member of the New Hampshire House has his or her own staff member. Contrast that with Congress, where the average staff is 19. As I said a few minutes ago, New Hampshire committees have one half of one person for staff support. Washington has an average of 68 staffers for every committee. The total legislative support services for the 424 members of the New Hampshire legislature is 130 people. The total legislative support services for the U.S. Congress is roughly 30,600. There is ample help. Get off the phone and do your job. So I did my own research, and eventually I came to some point that may or may not have been the happy medium between the two sides. But I got there by asking questions and then voting on what I had heard, what I felt, and not on who donated money to my campaign. I think I was usually able to sort out the ballot from the enhanced as various government officials and interested parties testified before our committee or answered my questions. Yes, with a less experienced Congress, some things will slip through, but they do today too. And let's define experience. Bigger office, status committee assignments, sucking up to leadership, adding more fat cats to your speed dial. People should be assigned to committees where they have some life experience, some know-how, and not how long you've been hanging around the clubhouse. Many assume that their elected officials are all-knowing, that they are conversant with the thousands of items that come before their respective bodies. They aren't. They can't be. So they rely heavily on their staff. And as you've just seen, they have lots and lots of help. To cover for this lack of knowledge, adroit politicos have a language all their own. They know how to answer a question without saying anything. They usually will inject some sort of legislative esoterica into the answer that acts as the derailment for the questioner, because the questioner has no idea what was just said but won't admit it. Robert McCluskey, author of Make Way for Ducklings, could have been summing up legislative speak as follows. I know that you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. With term limits, there may be some superficial loss of experience, but things will certainly be better than they are today, where decisions are predicated on satisfying a donor or measuring the impact on a partisan group of supporters in a future primary election. By staggering the influx of new legislators, there is a built-in experience or continuity factor. And why is this slide here? because you can't mention Make Way for Ducklings without a brief peek at the illustrations. Incumbents will argue vehemently that their experience is vital to the survival of the nation. I don't buy it. Experience is helpful, but a thoughtful look at today's Congress will lead to the conclusion that experience is primarily built up in gaming the system, currying favor with leadership, finding more donors, and hopefully re-election. But along the way, while acquiring that self-preservation experience, common sense, and the ability to do what is right has been tossed out the window. And in today's Congress, an in-depth knowledge of the issues is, more often than not, just as deep as the sheet of talking points on the podium. Lobbyists on K Street will go ballistic because their quid pro quo brand of lawmaking will basically come to a screeching halt. This is where the heavy money to defeat term limits will come from, because term limits will dramatically affect the entire paradigm for K Street. Lobbyists will still be present, but they won't be passing out the re-election dollars. And yes, with term limits in place, there will be lots of vacant office space up and down K Street. Organizations that today are known to be buying Congress will go all out to make sure the term limits never happen, because a straight up level congressional playing field doesn't work for them. Can term limits happen? The objection that we hear most often is Congress won't vote to throw themselves out of office. Of course they won't. But here is the way to address that. They may vote to let the voters decide this issue if they are given a reasonable amount of time for the process to play out. And the process would require a constitutional amendment, and those take time. Article 5 of the Constitution outlines how to amend or modify the document. It consists of two steps: proposal and ratification. Propose an amendment, top two squares. Either Congress, the blue side of the chart, or the states, the red side, can propose an amendment to the Constitution. All 27 amendments have come from the blue side of this illustration, so let's just stay there. In the top box, the U.S. Congress must propose the amendment with a 2/3 vote of both houses. It then goes to the states for ratification, two bottom squares. You can see that each state then has an option of either ratifying it via a state called ratifying convention, or by letting the state legislature vote on it. 3/4 of all state legislatures must approve of the amendment proposed by Congress. Yes, it's a heavy lift. Only 33 amendments have received a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, and of those, only 27 have been ratified by the states. But on this one, I sense the public is ready to engage. Is there a timeline for ratification? The U.S. Supreme Court has held that ratification must happen within some reasonable time after the proposal. Since the 18th Amendment, Congress has set an unofficial period of 7 years for ratification. And maybe in order to get the initial votes from Congress, we have to sweeten the pot for incumbents. So there may be a companion piece of legislation that has a provision that allows incumbents one more term after the amendment goes into effect, if you can do that, provided, of course, they can get re-elected. We might have to jiggle things around a little in the beginning as we turn over the House, because you don't suddenly want a chamber full of 435 rookies. The 7 years plus to make this happen allows several last gasps for ISP, incumbent self-preservation, which is probably the largest congressional objection to even considering the concept of term limits, but you'll never hear that. Using this timeline, as you saw earlier, letting the process play out, an incumbent House member who voted for the amendment would still be looking at the possibility of 3 or 4 more terms, 6 or 8 more years before the whole process played out and the Constitution was amended. So they're not immediately voting themselves out of office. For an incumbent senator, there could possibly be 2 additional terms out there, 12 years before the process played out and all ratification was completed. I think people are disgusted with the dark clouds that are always present with our current system, and term limits might be in play. The current system is totally broken. Take away the obsession, lust, and opportunity to get reelected, and maybe people will start doing what in their hearts and minds they know is right. The new legislators come out of the gate, they go around the track just once, so the special interest folks don't have an opportunity to build the usual long-term relationship where demands are made of the legislator in exchange for help with his or her re-election. People are almost always with me on this until they recognize that this is going to cost me my favorite congressperson. Think about it this way. If you are one of those who really feels passionate about an incumbent, then it's a sure thing you have an equal amount of disdain for other incumbents. So look at it as a trade. So we have to ask Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz to please board departure vessel number 1. In the next boat, we'll have Kelly Ayotte and Jeanne Shaheen, and so forth for 96 others in the Senate, 435 in the House, and 2 in the White House. And I'm sorry to report that they are all taking huge money from special interests. And yes, it is affecting how they vote. They are not breaking the law and accepting that money. It is the key to their political survival and their needed funds to get re-elected. For those of you who want to believe that their representative or senator is pure as the given snow, go to www.opensecrets.org and have a look around and relax. We are a nation of 316 million people. Don't elevate Congress people to some sort of pedestal. We can find tens of thousands of people that will do just as good a job or better as any current member in Congress. Many people such as that are right here in this room today. And I'm not pandering. I'm saying that common sense, decency, the knowledge to know and do what is right is not something that is rarely found. Most of us have those qualities within us, and there are ample, well-qualified people in this country to populate the 535 seats in Congress and the 2 seats in the executive branch. I'm not at war with Sanders, Cruz, Ayotte, or Shaheen. I'm at war with the fact that our federal lawmaking process is for sale, and the special interests know it. With term limits, you have completely extracted the money out of the system that flows into re-election campaigns for members of Congress, because there will be no re-elections. If you want some campaign finance reform, see what you can do to pass a law at the front end when they're trying to first get elected. But the day you pass that law, I guarantee you that someone will be crafting a loophole to circumvent it. The real danger comes when policy is being made in exchange for money to get reelected. Reelected so they can come back and repeat the process over and over again. With term limits, you have paved the way for intelligence, for conscience, for common sense to return to the decision-making process. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. Let's go out to recess.